This is your library.
Yeah, this is my library.
Wow. I mean, you've got thousands of books here.
Yeah.
Thousands of books.
One book escapes me. I should have pulled that up last night. I was so busy dealing with the Roman stuff. And it's not that big. It's a hardcover. It's over here. It's called African Gods. I had a spillover, so all that come over here, and this is still Egypt.
All of this is Egypt.
Right, so all that's Egypt.
Have you read all these books?
Yes, I've read everything there, you know, and all of this is Egypt. This is a spillover on the top, and then I had to fuse into religion. So this is Egypt, and then you know, religions will all have the foundation in Africa.
Can you talk and look at the same time, or would that distract you?
Surely.
I just wanted to ask you to deal with. So many young people ask me if all that you say is true, and we had that kind of knowledge, how did the Europeans conquer us?
Well, you have to understand, intellectual knowledge, spiritual knowledge, and then physical might are not necessarily in the same category. You can have all the intellectual knowledge that you want, and all the science and technology that you want, the greatest buildings and monuments you want. And if you have a savage being whose whole essence is to destroy, he can just come and destroy your stuff at any moment. You know, you're trying to treat them with humanity, and they don't even understand that concept. You see, just killing somebody because you can was a way of life for the ancient Asiatics, where the European is part of that phenomena. When the Vikings went out to go to work, they didn't carry no books or no intellectuals. They sharpened their sword and their stuff, and they got in their boats and they went to take somebody's stuff. And the family was waiting for them to come back. You know, Daddy, who did you kill? You know, oh, can I have that head? You know, so I see the people wearing skulls and stuff like that. You know, you have to understand, so the mentality of somebody whose whole existence is on destruction, war, and killing, and taking. See, we call it stealing today. No, it was okay to take somebody's stuff if you could. So that's why we call it the concept to develop something and not be able to protect it now is extremely dangerous. You know, because we've already learned from history. You can have these, you know, like right now, I have my library, all my books, but a bunch of thugs could come in here with their guns and shotguns, shoot me up and just take all of this, burn this down, and you would never even know knowledge existed. Well, that's kind of what happened in Kemet. You had a bunch of thugs who were illiterate, whose whole existence was on taking somebody else's stuff. They just come in and do you away. You know, so.
But with the kind of knowledge that you had, we should have been able to develop fighting machines, and
but let me say
we should
something.
have had the understanding to
we
protect
had
ourselves.
A army that kept them at bay for thousands of years. See, what people don't understand is that when the Greeks finally conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, that wasn't the first time they tried. They were just the first successful Europeans. We have to understand, for tens, at least for hundreds or for thousands of years, Asiatics had been trying to come into Africa, to Egypt, to conquer. We were always strong enough to repel them. We were greater military, we had greater skills, and we were able to, so we kept them at bay. See, nobody's talking about that. Nobody's talking about we defeated them for 10,000 years every year. We only talk about the one loss we got, and then you're devastated. You notice when a fighter, he could be champion, and then when he gets that one loss, you know, and everybody found out he got a weak spot, then the other people follow on that. Come on, we can just look at boxing like that there. You know, once Tyson, one of the greatest fighters in the history, once he was defeated, after that, 2 or 3 other people can defeat Tyson. Right? What, Roy Jones, he was knocking people out with, you know, once he got knocked out one time, people were like, oh, Roy Jones can be beaten. You know, after that, he got beat with his own stuff. Well, Kemet, the same thing happened to Kemet. So you can understand this game of boxing. Now I'm just going to put it to an intellectual world. So you're the champion for 100,000 years. The reigning champions of the planet Earth. You have no rivalry. And then all of a sudden, you take a slip. You know, somebody finally found out a weakness. You take a dive, you lose. Now people got your number. And so just like some of the greatest champions, Muhammad Ali, you know, all of these, just like some of the greatest champions in the boxing world, once somebody got their number, they were able to defeat it. And so now they knew Kemet's weak point. They knew that they spent more money on caring for the people, on building the temples and monuments and storing their books than they did on military. Even right now, what Israel, I think almost 80% of Israel's gross national product is on military defense. Because they know they're living in Isfet. They know they're living wrong. They know that. America, a great amount of our money is based on military defense. England, when they said the sun never set on their empire, 90% of their gross national product went into military. In ancient Kemet, what? Maybe not even 10% went into military. Everything was for nature, for the people, for development of science and stuff like that. Now we know that when you're top heavy like that, that's extremely dangerous. But you have to understand, the rest of the world was still basically asleep at that point. So our 10% military was good enough to defeat, you know, savage beings who were not organized. But we taught them. You have to understand, the people who defeated us, we taught them. We organized them. And then they put their money and their resources into their military, and we couldn't compete with that.
But isn't spiritual knowledge more powerful, and shouldn't it overcome the aggression and the desire to just kill and conquer?
I'll make this statement first. The spiritual power is greater than any technology than the Western world can develop. The spirit, effected at the right time in the right moment, can nullify an atomic bomb. That's how powerful the spirit is. But let me say this, my brother. No matter how dynamic you are, you could have been 6 times world champion, whatever. If I catch you at a vulnerable spot while you're in the toilet taking a dump, and I rush you at that moment, and you're trying to get your pants up, you know, and all that skill was for naught because I caught you off guard. Africa was caught with his pants down, taking a dump. And we weren't able to recover. Once you got that blow, and you know, it's hard to recover. It's not like the movies where guys just jump up and, You take a real blow, Africa took a real blow. You lost generations of your youth, generations of your geniuses. And Africa is still trying to recover.
And it hasn't been that long. That's
Hasn't been
put
that
it in
long.
perspective.
Right.
The Europeans only came into Africa in the last what?
The last 400-500 years in some numbers. With the Romans only dealt with the northern Africa. They couldn't come inside of the interior of Africa. And they tried, but they were defeated. So they couldn't. Ethiopia was never defeated in ancient times. Why? And remember, Ethiopia is a modern name. That's ancient Aksum. That's ancient Kash. That's Monroe, Napata. No European or Asiatic took an army into the interior of Africa and defeated them. So I need that to be stated for the record, because our African warriors are not giving their proper due. We're thinking that the Roman army just marched in. No, they were able to conquer Egypt and the outer exterior, Morocco, the outer exterior of the coast, but no Romans marched to the interior of Africa. No Greeks marched to the interior of Africa. Even Alexandria got to the border of ancient Kush and Kemet. And the priest said, if you venture across those mountains, you will be defeated. And Alexander, who was undefeated, turned around. In fact, he was so impressed by what he saw, he pledged himself to Amun-Ra, went through initiation, and became a Kemetic priest himself. So people don't know that, In fact, he was never going back to Europe. He was going to make Africa his home from now on. The Europeans didn't like that. Later, he was poisoned and killed, and then they had a power play to break up his empire. But we have to be really clear about what's going on. So I want to make that real clear. I hope I was.
Thank you. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
We made some reference to a couple of books as we were talking. I talked about the only symbol. One was the flower of life, the golden means. Here's a book here that talks about the golden means and flower. You'll see the symbol on certain churches. We talked about, for example, some astrological here. The Stars of Deep Beginnings, the Genesis of African Science and Technology. This is by Charles Finch. As you can see, I got a whole must. Dr. Van Sertima, if I pull him out, Egypt Revisited. He also makes reference here that even in his Blacks in Science, that the Africans were smelting iron and steel going back during the time of ancient Kemet. In fact, the rulers of ancient Kemet were all called Shamsu Haru, which were the blacksmiths. Okay, so I need to, put things into their proper perspective. The Mystery of Orion, we talked about the pyramids in ancient Egypt being aligned with Sahu, the certain stars. Here's by Adrian Gilbert and Robert Baval. Show clearly that the ancient astrological knowledge that we have today was known by the ancient Kemet in ancient Egypt. And the list goes on. I have the books dealing with astrology, astronomy, spirituality, the writing system. Like I said, the system of that we know as the Medu Neter was already ancient. By the time the ancient Kemet came into existence, our whole concept of mummification and all that, we get that from the knowledge that was learned from the inside of Africa. It was just perfected maybe in ancient Kemet. Up here I have, for example, all my African scholars here. It's important that we do like Dr. Jacob Crothers, Kemet and African worldview, if somebody want a real understanding of the lifestyle of ancient Kemet. This was done by Malana Karenga and Jacob Crothers. They also would want to read by Jacob Crothers the essays in ancient Egyptian studies. As dynamic as some of these books are, none of them are in any of the museums in the world. There are no black scholars' works in any of the museums dealing with ancient Kemet. Not even Diop, who was one of the greatest Egyptologists of his time, and in UNESCO in 1974 challenged the whole Egyptology world and defeated them. A knockout, clear. And his stuff is not even in there. And if you look over here, I have just about a list of all of Diop's stuff. Civilization and Barbarism, Great African Thinkers, The Cultivation of Unity in Black Africa, Towards African Renaissance, Black Africa, Diop, The Recolonization of Africa, The African Origins and Civilizations. So I, you know, and it goes on. I have some other works in here, but I try to pull all these works together.
You have the ones we want to talk about?
I can show the flower. No, I can't find. Hold on, I can't even find the one dealing with not the plier. Hold on, I got all.
Oh.
Okay, the flower of life. Tip. I know I said a few things that probably raise your eyebrows. There's a book called Temples of the African Gods. And this book is done by Tellinger and Jonathan Hine. This book was done is decoding the ancient ruins of southern Africa. Scholars have told us that the first civilization on earth emerged in a land called Sumer, some 6,000 years ago. Recent archaeologist findings suggest that Sumerians inherited much of their knowledge from an earlier civilization that emerged many thousands of years ago, before then, in southern Africa, the cradle of mankind. So I had mentioned before that ancient Sumer, ancient what we see Babylonia, and all of that, the Sumerian, the ancient India, all that came from Kush, from Eastern Africa, by way of Central Africa and South Africa. So I made that statement, and I know a lot of people's eyebrows kind of raised, but I wanted to now just show you some historical information, some background information that kind of backs up some of that information. In South Africa, carved into the stone, the camera might have a hard time picking this up, but if it can zero in on that.
Yes, I got that.
You got it. There's an Ankh inside of Ra, the sun. So the symbol of Ra and the symbol of the Ankh is right there. Now, I need to say a couple of things that's kind of going to mess with you just a little bit. First of all, that's carved in a stone called diorite. Diorite is a 9.0 on the hardness scale. It's almost as hard as a diamond. So you can't even use copper, brass tools to do that. And in some cases, you need something as hard as diorite to even carve into diorite. Or you need something harder. There are perfect circles carved and hewed inside of the stone that had to have been done with something like a laser, okay, that was done hundreds of thousands of years ago. So the Ankh that we know in ancient Kemet, which is known as the key of life, was known as life in South Africa 100,000 years ago. This knowledge that we know, a lot of the myths and origin that you learn about the gods and goddesses from Sumeria and Chaldonia, all come from ancient Kemet, and come by way of Eastern Africa. So I'm just going to show you a couple of other things that will kind of shine some light on some of this same information. We had even scientists like Kessler. Kessler got his knowledge of electricity and ingenuity from studying ancient Kemet. I talk about astrological alignments. If you look here, Just like in Nataplaya, you'll see an observatory, an astrological alliance aligning with the summer solstice and the equinox. And this is aligned with Sirius A. So let me read. It says, the eastern view of a 3D construction of Adam's calendar, the oldest version of the Egyptian Horus hawk, stands in line with the spring equinox. This is the falcon Haru, standing at the eastern equinox in total alignment. This is the spring equinox. At the right is the 3 alignment stones of Orion. The 3 aligned stones of Orion, which the Great Pyramid is aligned with. At the top corner, we'll see 2 pyramids. Okay. Which are directly aligned with the Great Zimbabwe and the Great Pyramids of Giza. So, Great Zimbabwe and the pyramids in Giza are in a line with the pyramids that are here in southern Africa. Here's another close-up of that same one. This is Haru, the falcon. You see Horus the falcon right here. In total alignment here. This is another stone carving of Haru. And this is made from diorite. So it's one of the hardest stones on the planet Earth.
Now, you said the great Zimbabwe, the great stone structures of Zimbabwe.
Right.
What was you saying about them? You made reference.
If you can kind of zero in on this, this is the Great Pyramid Complex, and word for pyramid, Mirkut, the Great Mirkut Complex in Kemet. If you look straight down, there's the Great Zimbabwe ruins. Mm-hmm. And if you look straight down, the ruins what I just showed you, with the astrological symbol and the pyramids in South Africa, are directly lined right here. So if we look at the map, this alignment is straight in alignment with the pyramids, the Mirkuts in ancient Kemet. Meaning that the people here had knowledge of what the people here has done. I don't think that would be a coincidence. Mm-hmm. And the same thing you saw in Nataplaya, we see in South Africa, only 100,000. So it's phenomenal when we talk about Nataplaya, saying that 6500 BCE, that's at least 200 years before ancient Kemet, all the astrological knowledge we had in ancient Kemet was known in Nataplaya. But when we see that all the knowledge known in ancient Kemet was known here, now you understand when I say that Kemet was the mouthpiece of the African continent. And that this was hundreds, thousands of years of accumulated knowledge. And then Kemet became the curator of this information. Kemet became the manifester. And if I can put it in even greater terms, after the last great, let me just show. This is Haru Imaketi. It's kind of weathered down. But so-called Sphinx, a Haru, a South African Sphinx, the Haru Imaketi, carved stone in alignment, just like the one in Giza here in South Africa. So I just want people to understand this Mfundishi just not on a head trip, bugging out, that this is based upon some real facts. Real facts. That's all on the African continent. There's no Babylonia. There's no Sumeria. There's no other civilizations outside of the African continent when this is going on the planet Earth. I made reference to a couple of the temples in ancient Kemet that precede dynastic Kemet. There was no Medu Neter on it. The only thing would be on it is the flower of life. And here, I have the same flower of life that the temple complexes in southern Africa and in Zimbabwe, they had the village based upon the same concept of the flower of life. Understanding the exact coordinates of the planet Earth and its alignment to astrological plottings in the sky. And all life as we know it on this planet is based on this formula of the golden means. So I just wanted to show you that Mfundishi was not just bugging out. Uh, that again, here we see Orion, Sahu, its alignment is in total alignment, just like in Giza. That alignment is done in South Africa. Only these megaglyphs, these stones are aligned 100,000 years ago. You can't, no one can tell you the origins of the great Zimbabwe ruins. They don't know what those ruins were used for. Even the people who live there today, it is so ancient and antiquity that even 10,000 years ago, some of that knowledge was lost, and the people still don't have a clue of exactly what was the exact reason for that particular complex, the whole housing development, everything. I wanted to show you another example of the golden mean, but I don't want to take up too much time here.
No, take up much time.
Okay. But it's clear. I just wanted people to understand. We had been operating in stone for a long time, and Zimbabwe shows that. If you'll see just the construction of this wall, look at the way the stones were aligned in this wall. Here, where I'm living in upstate New York, the indigenous Native American got these type of walls all around. I'm up here in the Hudson Valley, up in the mountains, and the Native Americans have these walls. I have these walls like this on my property here. These same walls exist. You know, maybe we'll just shoot a picture of it, you know, as we're walking out so you can see. No cement, no mortar holding them together. Here's another example of this great wall going around the complex in southern Africa. And that's not been repaired. This wall is literally tens of thousands of years old. You know, so we just refined it. If you can see, like the step pyramids was based on that concept, and then we refined it and took it to another level. Here is a book called by Swallow Delubis called The Temple in Man, and you can see the human being superimposed over the temple, showing that the temple is in exact coordinates and alignment with the human body. And so when I talked about the science of ancient Kemet, it's not just in the writing. The temples themselves were the repositories of the ancient knowledge. The temple itself was a repository of the mathematics, the astronomy, the astrology. All of that was aligned, left in here. Now when you start to read the Medu Neter, that's just an extra plus. You know, that's just an extra plus, like the light, the writing on the wall. Here's a guy that a lot of the Europeans were pretty mad at. Signs and Symbols of Primordial Man by Albert Churchward. He basically stated a couple of hundred years ago, when Africans were being enslaved, that all the knowledge that the Western world comes from these same Africans they were enslaving. And so the Western world was pretty angry with him, especially the Christian world. They were pretty angry because Churchward was showing that all the signs and symbols of our knowledge and wisdom and understanding was actually done by African people.
Can you read that little paragraph in there that he says the very people that we are enslaved today gave us all...
Here.
Hold on, go ahead.
Go ahead.
What does he say?
African people developed signs and symbols as a way of communicating and delivering messages. It is most unfortunate that most people who today are members of the secret societies have no in-depth knowledge of the history of the society and the unifying role played in the early intellectual life of the Nile Valley. It is through Churchward's examination of most of the known cultures of the people of today that signs and symbols of primordial man reveal. At this juncture, it is needed for us to remind us that the Nile Valley structures over 4,000 miles into the body of Africa, and that the creation of the Nile Valley cannot be attributed only to portions of North Africa that the Greeks called Egypt. The Nile River was the world's first great cultural highway, bringing people of cultures out of the body of the interior of Africa. This great cultural migration led to the peopling of Egypt, making Egypt a composite of civilization comprised of different African people who dwelled along the banks of the Nile. The civilization that developed in Egypt was a culmination of the civilization in Africa. Now, Churchward is saying this hundreds of years ago.
Who was Churchward?
Churchward, well, first of all, he was an atheist, but he was a great scholar and archaeologist and anthropologist, and basically studying signs, symbols, and trying to connect them on what was their meaning. And every road that he uncovered led back to Africa.
He was a European?
Yes, he was a European scholar. And like I said, the other Europeans were extremely angry because he was making this discovery at the height of the European transatlantic African slave trade. And so they were enslaved. Churchward said, you're enslaving the very people who are responsible for civilization as we know it. So I just need to, to just shine a little light here. This is a book, Black Genesis, which just came out, Robert Duvall and Thomas Brophy. And it basically, I touched upon this, it talks about it, Nata Playa, that's in the Sahara, that more than 6,500 years ago, or actually 65 BC, that's 8,000 years ago, all the science in terms of astrology that we know in ancient Kemet was known by these Africans who were living in the Sahara. Before, and that's over 2,000 years before ancient Kemet would be reorganized and unified. And so he goes a great deal of going into depth, explaining this is the same astrological alignment we saw in South Africa. That these same Africans had this knowledge and not to apply it. And it's also based upon Sirius A and Sirius B, which we know that the pyramids are aligned with Sahu. And so the same knowledge was known by these Africans who were in the Sudan before ancient Kemet came into existence. And so I already talked about ancient Kush, how it is the predecessor to all of this its knowledge, and actually birthed it. This is an actual this is a prehistoric picture of Het Haru over 3000 BCE. Now let me just make a couple of statements here before I even go. But the whole concept of Orion here, Orion mystery, people want more astrological information. They can read this particular book. Here's Dr. Charles Finch, The Star of Deep Beginnings, The Genesis of African Science and Technology. And let me just make a statement here. The modern world, traceable to iron ore that was mined 43,000 years ago in southern Africa. And so 43,000 years ago, iron ore was being mined in southern Africa. In the Great Lake region, that's around Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, iron was being smelted, or ore was being captured and smelted more than 25,000 years ago. So, see, we have no concept of what we're dealing with. So when we're talking about Kemet, which was only 6,000 years ago, they are the benefactors of all of this information that was taking place in the interior of Africa. They just all kind of pulled it together at this point. And then Dr. Van Sertima talks about the smelting of the iron in the furnaces that were actually being used. He has actually pictures of them that were used in Eastern Africa. This is before Kemet, and even during the time of ancient Kemet. because all the natural resources were still coming from the interior of Kemet. I talked about Manetho, and I needed people to be able to understand. This is a book concerning Egyptian history. And Manetho, like I said, was the high priest of the Temple of Amun, and he was living during the time of the Greek occupation, the Ptolemies, and he put the history of ancient Kemet in terms of dynasties that we're kind of using today. But the ancient Kemetu never used dynasties or anything like that there. Akhenaten didn't know he was in the 18th dynasty of ancient Kemet. Tutankhamun didn't know he was in the 18th dynasty. Ramses didn't know he was in the 19th dynasty. Okay, that was all done in the aftermath. And we're using this like it's the foundation of African history. It is not. It is not the foundation. Like I said, Dr. Asa Hilliard, Dr. Jacob Crothers, Dr. Ben, Dr. Chancellor Williams, and all of them came together and broke Africa up into the first golden age, second golden age, third golden age, fourth golden age. And if I can just summarize them just a little bit so that you'll have just a little knowledge.
Yes.
Ancient Kush was in existence for thousands of years before the first reunification of the golden age led in by Narmer. And in my book, I show you the faces. So I wanted to be crystal clear that Africans at all the stages. And so here's a picture of Narmer, an obvious African, is the founder of the first golden age of the reunification of ancient Kemet. I use the word reunification because I already showed you Haru Imaketi, and a lot of these structures were already in place by a group of unified Africans thousands of years before Narmer. Due to cataclysms destroying much of the Earth's surface, devastating large numbers of the Earth's population, man shifted back and had to start over again. But some of these priests kept the knowledge and developed a society that would be able to take off where they left out. Ancient Kemet is one of those societies. And we'll see other places around the world where some of this knowledge would be to take off. We'll see over here, we have Menchu Hotep, this big black brother here, look like Shaq, okay? He is the founder of the second golden age. It's the third and fourth golden age. He is Asar, believed to be the first ruler of ancient Kemet in dynastic times, going back over 36,000 years ago. Obvious Africans, and we go on. So all of the four golden ages of ancient Kemet were all founded by Africans. And it is clear that Haru Imaketi is a big black face that you know as the Sphinx. If we can see Het Haru, the golden calf, we can see Hemet Nasut Weret, Tai, who was a beautiful African queen, one of the rulers of ancient Kemet. And again, we see all Africans. Look at this brother with locks. You don't even hardly see Imhat Amun. Amin Himhat. Look, obvious Africans. These are all rulers as ancient Kemet. He's a ruler in the second golden age. So you don't have to wait to the 25th dynasty to get African rulers. All the rulers. Look at his Akhenaten over here. He didn't have no disease. He was a brother with a big butt. I see brothers like this all the time. He don't have no, elephantitis or no other diseases. All right, so we have to be real clear. I break down chronologies inside of my book so that will explain the first, second, third, and fourth golden age. So now, if I'm just in review, during the first golden age, we had technology that we can build pyramids. Again, those pyramids were built on top of structures that already existed in many cases. The largest number of Mirkut's pyramids that still exist in the world is not in Egypt, but it's in Sudan, ancient Kush. Okay? Even when Egypt fell, the ancient Kushites were still building pyramids all the way into the modern era. much smaller, but still the same science and concepts were still put in place. So I need to make sure that we clearly understand that. So the Pyramid Age is the big highlight of the first Golden Age. All the science is already intact. I need people to even that concept of a castle. Castle is an African phenomena. And the birthplace of the castle that we know of comes from ancient Kush, or in the Sudan, or you call Nubia. And so not Europe. Africans who traveled into Europe via the Moors and stuff like that helped build these structures in Moors. So we had these castles were built in Ireland and France and stuff. But those were Africans who were the architects and the engineers that helped build those, and people who were masons.
Say that again. Say that again.
The first castles.
For an example, which castles?
What the castles that you see in England, the castles you see in Ireland, the castles you see in Europe, like in France and in Germany. Those were all built by African people. They were the engineers of that, and the architectural structure comes from that. In several of the books, I'll even show. Oh, here, watch. I'm going to show you something that just will shine some light on that. In my chapter 12 of Spiritual Warriors Are Healers, I show. Am I still on? Yeah. Okay. In chapter 12 of Spiritual Warriors Are Healers, this is at Beni Hassan, which was ancient Mahez. Ancient Mahez is where the warriors were buried during the second golden age of ancient Kemet. And right here is a castle. And this shows you all blacks defending a castle. So on here it shows you how to attack a castle, and it shows how to defend from a castle. This is second golden age in ancient Kemet. There were no castles in Europe. In fact, there isn't a city in Europe when this was taking place. This is still 1,000 years before Greece. The Greek society, which is the first civilized Europeans to develop big cities and stuff like that. And so Africans are showing you how to attack a castle 1,000 years before Greece. And 1,500 years before Rome. And so, I just want to be real clear. In fact, I don't have in this book, but I have some books I didn't get a chance to pull out. But you can see castle walls that were 12 feet thick in ancient Kemet, in Nubia, and in Kush. So the whole concept of the castles that we know in terms of architectural drawing is an African phenomena that was used for trade and to be able to defend that which you were trading until the time of the trade, so no one could come in and steal your stuff. And so all those castles were placed at trading points, at trading ports. So that was the original use. It wasn't like somebody's home. Original castles were trading ports and trading centers where commerce took place, and you wanted to be able to protect your commerce until the actual trade took place. Okay, so that's what and the castles had moats around it and all of that. So I just want to be clear, that's not a European phenomenon, that's African. And the Moors are the ones that build the first capitals in Europe.
First castles in Europe?
Right, built by the Moors. And the first castles would be in Spain and in places like that before they are to go other places like that with the design that we kind of see today. And naturally the Moors in the Spain, they got it, from the interior of Africa. So I just want to be clear. The second golden age, the reunification of Kemet, is called the classical period, even by European Egyptologists. This is where the writing of ancient Kemet and their the mythology of ancient Kemet is all put down in the Medu Neter. And most of the classical writings and stuff like that is done during this period of time. See, during the first golden era, we have what we call the Mirkut Sabiat, or the pyramid texts. That's the first golden age, the pyramid text, the Mirkut Sabiat. And it's talking about a time prior to Narmer. So I want you to understand, they're talking about astronomy, astrology, the stars, the heavens, the imperishable imperishable stars. This is known before Narmer, the first dynasty of ancient Kemet. And the pyramid text is the first religious, so-called, they call it religious, but it's spiritual text recorded. So spirituality existed for thousands of years. But in terms of recording in a text that you can read, you want to read the Mirkut Sabiat or the pyramid text. You can still go and buy that today. Okay? And so you can see that we understood astronomy, astrology. We understood spirituality at the highest point, that the ruler, when he died, joined his spiritual ancestors that exist in the heavens. So is above, so below. All that's in the pyramid text. The oldest spiritual books in the world. All right, so it's not no Mfundishi feel-good hour. This is all based upon writings. Okay? That's the first golden period. Remember, this writing is about a time period that took place thousands of years before that. But it took Africans several thousand years to regroup after the last major catastrophe on Earth. And so what you're seeing in ancient Kemet, about 4000 BCE, is Africans who have regrouped now and can start their civilization again. That's why Kemet looked like it started almost at its zenith and started to go downhill, because they already had the knowledge. Now the priests had to develop a group of people who could carry this out. Okay. The second golden age now is going to bring in what we would call the Coffin Texts, or the Karasebiat. The Karasebiat, the Coffin Texts, now are groups of writings that was placed inside of the tombs of the ancient Kemetu. They talked about the spiritual writings that was in the pyramid text and other spiritual writings that had been recorded from before ancient Kemet. This was all placed, these prayers, these all this stuff was placed inside of the tombs, the time capsules, I call them, because they are truly time capsules when you look at what their function was and what they're doing today, and the information we can still get from them. So it's kind of a misnomer by saying the Coffin Texts, but again, if we're letting Europeans define the name of our books, that's what's going to happen. In the third golden age, you were issued in what was called the Pert Imharu, the Book of Coming Forth by Day. And the European Egyptologists call that the Book of the Dead. So you see, we can't depend on them defining our stuff. It was a book of everlasting life, not a book of the dead. Okay, but because they found it inside of the tombs of what they call dead people, they just named it that. But it's the Book of Coming Forth by Day. It's a book on how to be immortal. On the book of how to overcome obstacles in the afterlife and spiritual entities that one has to deal with in the spiritual world. That the spiritual world is even larger than this physical world. And the ancient Africans clearly understood that. And even Africans today who have not lost their mind still understand this. Okay. The fourth golden age deals with Kush coming back in because Africa has lost its way again. In the fourth golden age, the brothers from ancient Kush come back into Africa to bring back the teachings of the old ways. So you have the great writings of Kashta, the great writings of Pianki. You have these great writings, Shabaka. And so we have the Shabaka texts during the fourth golden age. These writers are coming back, and they're not writing anything new. The fourth golden age, Shabaka is saying, no, you need to go back and study Ptah. And so the greatest records we have of Ptah, the creative spark of the architect of the universe, is based upon Shabaka's writing. He's just rewriting the scrolls, the papyri that had been destroyed, some of the walls that had been destroyed, some of the temples that had been destroyed. It was a Renaissance era of Africans reclaiming and bringing back to life what had been lost. So those are those four. The rest of the golden age would go back into Kush, and we will see that later in Axum, Napata, Meroe. Those are other offshoots of ancient Kemet. Egyptologists will tell you that those were Africans who were the Egyptians Egyptianized them, and that they were following what is the other way around. These ancient Africans created what is Egypt, and all they did was go back to their traditional ancestor worship. It wasn't something that was shoved down their throat or that was totally new. No one else, other people, ancient Kemet traveled to other places in the world. Nobody else could duplicate ancient Kemet but Africans. And I need to make this statement. The Greeks came into ancient Africa and stayed for what? 300 years as rulers. If you go to Greece, outside of the Parthenon, and there's no other evidence of high civilization. They cannot duplicate. They don't have the Neteru all over the place. They don't have giant statues all over the place. They don't have pyramids all over the place. They were there 300 years. How come they couldn't duplicate it? The Romans would have come in after the Greeks in 30 BCE, and they had access to all the temples. They had access to all the information the Greeks had. They built a couple of temples, a couple of monuments, their cathedral, their Colosseum. But outside of that, there's no other. This Kemet is not duplicated because they don't have that knowledge again. They can't. They build some statues, and we can see we are the first to etch in stone. So when you see those Roman statues and that's their teachers were the Africans, the African sculptures, the African scholars. They were still present in Rome at every stage. They were still leaders in Rome at every stage.
You had to talk.
The word Senu, the Senate in Greece and the Senate in Rome wore the long robes, almost like a galabia, like a kaftan, or, the long robes with the cloth over their arm. That's from ancient Kemet. The word S in the Medu-Neter alphabet is a bolt of cloth wrapped down that would be draped over the arm. And so the Greeks and the Romans wanted you to know that their most learned was based upon the knowledge from ancient Kemet, and they wore their cloth over their fabric, over their bodies, the same way they did in ancient Kemet, and they were the most learned of the Western society. That's where that comes from. So I need you to be really clear about that. And they don't show you, but many of the people who still were the advisors of the Senate and in Greece and Rome were still African priests. The whole Masonic, listen, the Mason era, the whole, idea of Masons and Masonic, this were sculptures based upon the art of Ptah. In ancient in ancient Greece, they say if it wasn't for Ptah, we would have no houses, no buildings. We would still be living in caves. This is what the ancient Greeks said. And Ptah is the patron of all craftsmen. So that's where the Masonic order comes from.
Where is that written? If it was not for Ptah, we would have no houses, no.
You'll come back. I got some works to get. I have to go back to the library and start pulling this stuff out. But this is the words by the Greeks. I want you to understand that. Who are the Greek scholars? I need to go back and get the book by George G.M. James.
Yes.
George G.M. James showed you that every so-called Greek scholar studied in Africa. Every single one studied in Africa in those very same temples we just talked about. So I need to be real clear.
Yes.
Yes.
Would you continue in terms of how Rome and Greece, even the way they carried themselves, even the way they dressed, and so forth, was a duplication?
It was a duplication of what they saw in ancient.
Can you give more examples?
Well, first of all, I talked about the Senate, who were the most learned. Okay, that was a perfect example. They talked about their structures, their buildings, their temple. They didn't have no temple. Europe had no temples. They had no major cities before they came in contact with Africa. I need to make that real clear. And can't nobody show you some cities and stuff that was there. Right now, one of the biggest phenomena in Europe is they're uncovering pyramids that existed in Europe thousands of years, that are even older than ancient Kemet. But they weren't built by Europeans. They were built by Africans. I need to be clear. We are the original inhabitants of all of the continents on the planet Earth.
If they're found in Europe, how can you say they were built by
We are the first Europeans. Europe is named after Europa. an African queen of North Africa. You know? So even the word Europe is named after an African black woman. So I need to be clear about that. You know, we are the first Asiatics. The first Asians are Africans or black people. Southern Asia was populated first. You know, we get the yellow, pale-looking Asiatics who are the descendants from the Mongolians. And the Mongolians come from the extreme north, like the Europeans come from the extreme north, the ice people. So we have the sun people and the ice people meet, and that's when you have the people of color. So I need to be real clear about that. The ice people, lacking melanin, meet the sun people who are melanated. And then you have the variations of the brown people in between. So you need to be clear about that. The original happens of Japan were black people, the Anu, the original happens of southern China. When I went to China, I traveled into the interior, and there was a whole village of black people with flat face, slanty eyes, thick lips, big nose, look just like Africans. The only difference is that they also look like the Chinese, or the Chinese look like them. When I asked them when did they get there, they said they were there before the Chinese. And they also had an interior art. They weren't taking Chinese Kung Fu. They had their own martial science.
Let me ask you, hasn't there been research lately that determined Europeans are descendants of Neanderthal?
Yes.
Talk about that.
That's the latest research. I've been talking about this for over 25 years. See, we have to clearly, as the Africans left, Diop is probably the best to talk about this. Can you just pause for just 1 second? In 1974, Diop challenged UNESCO and the whole Egyptology world. Dr. Shank Anta Diop and Theo Bengo challenged all of them. And they came with their books, they came with their artifacts, they came with DNA samples of the mummies. They came prepared. The Egyptologists just showed up with their white skin and thought that was enough. And they got spanked. At UNESCO, they proved that the ancient Egyptians were African people or black-skinned people. Number two, they proved that the language, Madunecha, linguistic, was African, and it can be found in the basic Bantu languages throughout Africa. And he took many samples of African language and showed where those words still exist today, even used the same way they were in ancient Emma. So the people were black, melanated people. Number two, their language was African. Their spirituality, all of the spiritual paraphernalia of ancient Kemet came from the interior, from the burning of the frankincense and the myrrh, the wearing of the leopard skin, the rituals that they went through can be found as South Africa, East Africa, West Africa, throughout there. The same rituals was in there. So they proved that the spiritual system of ancient Kemet was African. The deities, if they looked at all the statues, were African. All the animals were from Africa. No Asia. It wasn't no Asiatic. It wasn't no camel in there. There was no Indian elephants. Everything was from the African continent, from the interior of Africa. So they proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the culture of the ancient Kemetu, the ancient Egyptians, was African. And they showed from their clothes to the way they worshipped, their family habits, their agriculture habits, the cattle that they had, the plants that they grew, all came from the interior of Africa, not from Asia or Europe. So it was clear. So culturally, linguistically, spiritually, architecturally, every phenomena showed that the ancient Egyptians were African people and that everything that we know about Egypt came from the interior. Diop proved this beyond a shadow of a doubt.
Even their descendancy,
matrilineal system coming from the woman. Thank you very much. All shown, especially in ancient Kush, which was the main, ancestors of the ancient. They still had a matrilineal. In ancient Kush, in some cases, they had just as many women rulers as they had men, and in some areas, more women rulers than men. And even in Kemet, the throne was passed through the woman. Aset is the throne maker, and that's what she wears, the throne on her head. And so all dealing, and just the way the ancient Africans treated their women. Total respect. Not like Asiatics or Europeans or anybody else on the planet. All right, so very, very clear. So I want to be, clear on those points. Now, I said we populated the whole planet, and Diop showed you he showed you the various different types of 6 different types of humanoids on the planet, and all 6 existed on the African continent. Only 2 could be found outside of the African continent. And for example, one was Neanderthal man. Neanderthal might have left Africa maybe 150,000 years ago. He died out most of the places, but managed to survive in parts of Northern Europe. And then he is the predecessor and the ancestor of later what will become Europeans and some Mongolians, Asiatics. And so that's this extreme aggressive nature. So Neanderthal didn't develop a written language or a spoken language. Neanderthal basically lived like a gorilla would live. You know, foraging, finding food, living in a cave, so that's early man, the Neanderthal. Now, modern scientists have shown, because only in 2011 was the first time that they were able to break down the DNA of a Neanderthal. Everything was too old or they couldn't find it, but in 2011, they were able to break down the DNA of a Neanderthal. And they found out that the DNA of Neanderthal didn't exist in any of the indigenous Africans of today. It only existed in about 75% of the European population from Europe.
75% of the European population has a DNA that goes to the Neanderthal?
To the Neanderthal. And the other 25% is part of that whole Adam, that Eve thing that they show you where, I heard you mention and talk about that they can trace everybody to one African woman, probably from East Africa. Well, that other 25% that's not in Neanderthal, it stems from Africa. And it's part of our descendants. But this, when we say that the Europeans have more crimes against humanity than any people on the planet, it's because they're not human. They're humankind, kind of like a human. So they even use that terminology, and we never took it literally. But you need to take it literally. They're humankind, kind of like a human. And just like Neanderthal does